Hey everybody, welcome back to the Cinefile. This week we're talking about If Beale Street Could Talk from 2018. Jake, did you like this movie?
I liked it a lot. I admit that I hadn't seen it until we picked it for the podcast, but we picked it because, as we all know, February is Black History Month, and so we wanted to highlight a film by a Black filmmaker with a predominantly Black cast. You know, really focusing on the Black story in America. Right? We wanted to amplify that voice because that's what this month's all about.
Right.
But I hadn't seen it until this time, and it had been on my watch list for a while, and I'm glad we watched it for this because I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And the other reason we kind of picked it is Romance Month here at the Cinephile, and this does tell a pretty modern day kind of romance.
Yeah,
I don't think it's overly. It's not what I would call like cheesecake. It's
right.
definitely a switch from When Harry Met Sally, which we talked about last
We
week.
really just kind of went in a whole 180 from
Yeah,
last
I
week.
mean, because I was under the impression that this was more of a romance film, but having watched it, it's so much deeper than that, and that really that isn't the forefront
Yeah,
of this movie. Obviously, the story has to do with romance, has to do with a couple, but
right.
it really highlights a lot more.
Yeah,
Um,
I find it interesting that you point that out because like it is a romance story, but it isn't. It's a romance story in that it's about the relationship between a man and a woman, and that's in their families surrounding that, and that's kind of the core of the story is Fonnie and Tish and their romance, and we see kind of how that builds and where they're at now. But I feel like it's a very realistic approach to a love story in that like
yes,
it's messy and it really
yeah,
leans into the messiness, and in a way like it's almost like a truer love story, I think, because it's able to show that like when you found like your person, your one that you want to spend the rest of your life with, um you know they're there through all the messy stuff, and things will get messy, but when you keep choosing them and they keep choosing you over and over again in the midst of all these obstacles, in the midst of all these issues and problems, that's what real love is.
yeah, it's definitely more it's more grounded and it's more gritty
Yeah,
just as a romance. I think a lot of times when we think of these rom-coms, which this isn't a rom-com, but when you think of rom-coms, it's more idealized, it's more um uh exciting. Nothing really goes wrong. It actually, usually the template for a rom-com is that everything goes right, then there's some sort of conflict that they
mm-hmm.
can't get over, and they go their separate ways until they eventually realize, wait, we actually love each other, and they come back together. That's something that happens pretty much in every rom-com. That's definitely a template. And so but that's not realistic. That's not how life works.
Yeah.
And so this is a better depiction, in my opinion, of what romance really is, what
Mm-hmm.
love really is, because love is hard. So the story of this movie is about Fonnie and Tish, two young people who get together. They've loved each other for a very long time, but Fonnie is wrongly accused. Um, at least that's what the story tells us. Wrongly accused of committing a crime, raping somebody, and so he is thrown in jail, and then Tish is doing the work to try and get him out because he's falsely accused. And so that also goes to kind of what we are talking about Black History Month as well. Just in that you see some definite racial bias in this movie from one of the cop characters. There's a scene later in the film where they go into a like a mini mart, and there's this weird guy calling her a tomato, right? Doesn't he call her like a cherry tomato or
Yeah.
something? And he kept saying like, "Come here, like, don't you love tomatoes?" Or I don't know. It was like a weird interaction about tomatoes. Um, And then, Fonny does the Admiral thing, is like, hey, get away. And this guy was being predatory, creepy. And so he throws him out of the mini mart. And then the cop automatically assumes, like, he's at fault for this. He's like, where are you? And that just shows that this movie is just so much more than love.
Well, I mean, it
Um,
takes place in Harlem in the 70s, right? And so it's Harlem, we all know, is kind of the quintessential black neighborhood. It's if
right.
you think of a black neighborhood, you think of Harlem, is probably the most famous one. Um, and it's in the midst of the 70s, so at the height, I guess to say, really coming off the height of the civil rights movement and everything, and still that struggle for racial equality, a struggle that we're still seeing continue on to this day. It's a very real thing. That still, racism is a real thing that exists in this country, and it's something that we will never understand,
Right.
but we recognize that it happens, and it's wrong, obviously.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. And so as Tish is doing this, she finds out that she's pregnant. And so she goes through this pregnancy. There are different interactions with the family. They all kind of get together and she tells them. And we'll talk a little bit about that interaction. Jake and I both have some thoughts on that. And also the struggle of working as a pregnant woman as well, trying to make her way in the world, but also trying to find money to be able to have this attorney that can help them, but the attorney struggling too. And then the mother goes to Puerto Rico, to try and find the accuser. And so they're all these different pieces that kind of line this story. It's kind of winding and weaving. But it's a story I really enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would, because I thought it was just a pure romance movie, and sometimes I'm a little iffy with those. But I got a lot more than what I expected, and I'm really grateful for that. Any time that we can sit and maybe for just a minute feel or glimpse what somebody else's life is like, um, I think that's evident of good storytelling.
yeah, right. 100%. Barry Jenkins, the director of this, is just he's a master at a layered story, getting you to experience all these different emotions with this character, and really kind of I feel like he's a very immersive director. He's famous for
Mm-hmm.
Moonlight in 2016, I believe. Another,
Right.
and it reminds me a lot of Moonlight in the way it really draws you into this character, and really draws me into someone who I am nothing like, right?
Right. Right.
I don't look like them, I don't act like them, I don't experience the things that they go through in their life, but he really draws me in with this. And I think it's just he does a wonderful job of telling the story. And he also adapted the screenplay. It's adapted
Mm-hmm.
from a James Baldwin book, If Beale Street Could Talk, by the same name. And the movie opens with a passage of Baldwin's book, which I think really sets the tone
I
for the
agree.
whole movie. And I wish it's a longer passage, so I couldn't read it word for word. I wrote it down. But what stuck out to me is he says it sums up to the fact of every black community has a Beale Street. The Beale Street of
Right.
name, I believe, is in New Orleans, and
Mm-hmm.
Baldwin writes that that's where his father grew up and first heard Louis Armstrong play, if I remember right. But he says, whether that's it's in Harlem, it's in Jackson, Mississippi, like every black community has a Beale Street, and you really understand, I think, community and what that means for African Americans in this country, because in a world that that shows in this movie where everyone on the outside is really out to get you, it's that community and that connection that is really
Mm-hmm.
important. And
Yeah.
so I
And
think
you
that
mentioned
really
Barry.
sets up that really just I think sets up the whole movie right there.
Yeah, and you mentioned Barry Jenkins. He was nominated for an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. He also, he directed Regina King, who won an Oscar
Mm-hmm.
for her Best Supporting Actress nomination from this movie. It was also nominated for Best Original Score. It did not win those, but Barry Jenkins was also nominated again for a BAFTA, which is like the Academy Awards but for Britain.
Yeah.
And he was nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay there too. I mean, it is really really well written. I do think it honors the book. That's not a book that I've read, but you can tell based on, like you said, it set the tone by that first passage, and it seems to really. I mean, if he's nominated for all of these adapted screenplay awards, he definitely did a good job of
He did
adapting.
something right.
Yeah, he definitely did something right. This movie also, it didn't make a ton of money at the box office. It made about 20 million, but this is what we would call an awards film. It's not a film that is necessarily a crowd pleaser, but it's an important film. It's a film that tells a story. It puts us in the 70s Black experience for maybe an hour or two. And films like that, you may not hear. One of the reasons why we do the Cinefile is we want to share movies with you that you may not know. Both Jake and I love movies, and we've heard of If Beale Street Could Talk. But a lot of times, a lot of people won't hear about movies like this, even though it's great, great cinema and it's stuff that's really important. The reason you may not have heard of If Beale Street Could Talk is because it's an awards film. But it definitely got some recognition, and Regina King, whose performance was fantastic in this, well-deserved Oscar win for her.
For sure. I mean, it's incredible. Every scene she's in, I was glued to the screen. I couldn't take my eyes off it because she projects um such a power through her character. You know, it's a commanding performance, if you will, without being in your face, right? You know, it's not, she doesn't shove the performance in your face. She draws you into the performance, which I think is, you
Right.
know, is the mark of a really great actor. And so it's a wonderful performance and very deserved Oscar there.
Yeah, for sure.
Doing some research, you know, the thing that really jumped out to me, like we've talked about, it's adapted from the James Baldwin novel. But when I was struck by how well lit this was and how well shot it was. Like, it's gorgeous. I mean,
Yeah.
look at some of these stills. Like, it's absolutely a gorgeous film. You know, the
Right. Right.
colors, the lighting, it's so warm and inviting, and it's really beautiful to the eye. And so, diving into that a little bit, I found it interesting that when Barry Jenkins and his director of photography sat down to you know come up with the look of the film, they were inspired by a photographer, Roy DeCarava, I believe is how you say his name. But he is a Black photographer from Harlem who really kind of put Black fine art photography, like made it a genre. Like, he's kind of the father of Black fine art photography. And if you look up some of his pictures, like, they're absolutely gorgeous, and you see, you know, how well they were able to translate his lighting scheme and his photos into this movie, which don't always translate well, right? Still pictures
Right.
don't, you know, your lighting concepts don't always transfer well into lighting for film and everything, but they made it flow so well, and they really picked up in the essence of this. And the reason I pointed out is, you know, this really just it almost plays into the authenticity of the story, right? You know,
Yeah.
because DeCarava, he photographed, you know, the people around him in Harlem. He photographed his neighborhood. That's where he lived. You know, that's where he grew up. That's where he hung out. That's where he did his whole life. And so
Right.
he knew this community so well and wanted to highlight this community in his work. And so just that little nuance, not only is it gorgeous, but I think really elevates the story even more. Adding on to that, you know, it's from a James Baldwin novel, such an important book. And so I just find it so fascinating and so intentional, right? That was a choice, you know, and it wasn't an easy choice, I'm sure. Like I said, lighting concepts don't always transfer well between stills and film, but they wanted to highlight that, they wanted to add that level to the story. And I think, that's makes it all the more special, I think. Right.
And that the for me, the mise en scène, which
Mm-hmm.
if you don't know what mise en scène is, it's essentially everything that's in the picture frame. So when you're filming something, it's essentially basically everything that you can see
The way I
from a
had it
set.
explained to me is the mise en scène is the choice of everything you use to put in the frame and the choice of everything you take out of the frame.
Yeah, that's actually even a better explanation because there's things that you remove or you don't add in purposefully. But that's one of the things I noticed about this film, is the lighting, is the way it's shot, the mise en scène of the set design, the colors. Um, that was something that it's interesting you mentioned that they went to this photographer and it kind of looked at his work and wanted to kind of adapt that because that was something that was a choice that I noticed. And that's not necessarily meaning that it's a bad choice because it stood out. I think it stood out for the right reasons.
Yeah, I mean,
But
it
that,
stood out in that, I'm sitting here watching this and I'm like, oh my God, this is not only a beautiful story, like it matches it beat for beat with beautiful pictures, right?
yeah,
Even
yeah,
even even like shots in the jail were visually beautiful, which trying to make a jail scene feel like a jail scene, but also visually beautiful is like, that's not something easy to do. And I think the fact that it is Harlem, and a lot of white people, I think, have a negative association with Harlem. They think of Harlem as maybe it's a rougher neighborhood, but like it's a neighborhood like anyone else. Like it's a neighborhood in New York. How is it
right.
different than the Bronx? How is it different than Queens? Right?
Yeah. And that I think something else that really stood out to me in this movie was the way the screenplay. I mean, we've talked about it, but the way it was crafted. This movie, and for I guess it'd be a lack of better term, is very smooth. The way it's shot too. I don't know if the frame rate was different or what it was. There's a lot of kind of slow mo
Mm-hmm.
at points, but it really it takes some difficult subjects and makes addressing those very inviting.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when you watch I've seen certain movies where they're what I would call preachy. They don't necessarily allow you as the audience member to make your own conclusions. The conclusions that they want you to have are kind of forced down your throat. And there are movies like that.
Mm-hmm.
This, I think, is different. It creates a space, if you will, um, in the way the narrative is written, in the way it is shot, in the color scheme. I think kind of it being darker and richer in the lighting, it creates just a warmer environment where you can kind of have a discussion about some of these topics. It's not off-putting, right? If you were to look
No,
at the
not at all.
cinematography or the lighting, and it would be really harsh. Like essentially the lighting here, you can see right here. These are LED panels, and that's really harsh lighting. If you were to shoot this movie but with really harsh lighting, I think you would have a different opinion um,
Mm-hmm.
of the movie. And so it was all systematic. But I was sitting there watching this, and I'm like, this is, for lack of a better word, just smooth, warm.
Yeah.
It's just it goes down easy.
Yeah.
And when you can take a subject matter that is so important, but that some people unfortunately don't understand, are not willing to understand, and you can make it as inviting as you did, that's a special kind of storyteller.
Right. Yeah. And adding a layer, another layer to that smoothness is the score. Like it's a gorgeous score, but it's very, smooth 70s jazz, right?
Yeah, which I
Very
liked.
plays into that, and it's gorgeous. I would buy this on a record and like just listen to this to like relax. But like even adding that layer to it, just emphasizes like how lyrical almost it is, right? How it just kind of flows, and it's very legato, and it's very like, everything kind of blends together.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think overall, this movie is something, if you're watching it, and if you're watching this and you haven't seen it yet, I'd encourage you to pause this, and go and watch this movie. And if you can look at it and you notice the score and you notice the lighting and you notice how smooth it is, I mean, this is just an incredibly well crafted film. Um, I think some of the supporting characters too are really even pretty interesting in and of themselves. I like the dynamic between the dads,
Yeah.
um, of both Fonny and Tish. Uh, they're kind of legends. They're like brothers, in a way.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that those families don't get along. There's a scene in the beginning of the movie where it's sassy.
Very much
For like,
so.
yeah, it's very sassy. And the mom of Fonny, she just I've that's what a Pharisee is. You
Yeah.
know, like if you were to go and read in the New Testament where Jesus talks about the Pharisees, um, like if you to just and also have her picture right next to it, and when you're reading it, you'd be like, yeah, that's her.
She
She
is
like is.
so holier than thou.
That's what
And
I'm
it's
saying,
just
man.
like it's like
And
you can't just be happy. Like she's literally gonna be a grandmother. And
yeah,
she's just like she's just going off about how like this child's gonna be a bastard and all this stuff. And it's
yeah,
just like you can't just be happy. Like your son's in jail and the woman he's in love with is about to have his kid. Like that's a really hard situation. That's a
yeah.
really hard situation for anyone to be in. And then
And
put
it's
it
not
in
like she didn't.
1970s Harlem. Like that's mind-boggling. You can't just show a little bit of support. A little bit.
Right. And it's not like she didn't know Tish. They've been
Yeah.
friends forever.
There's
So it's like,
flashbacks when they're like what, 11, I want to say.
yeah, like it's so it's not like she didn't know this
Yeah.
person. So and one of the things that they say, that Tish does a voiceover and talks about how she thinks Fonny is too good for Tish, but maybe he is deserving of Tish
Mm-hmm.
because of some of his mistakes. There's like an interaction there. Um, so she obviously doesn't, I guess, think highly of Tish, but especially now that she's having his kid, she's like,
Yeah.
I don't like this. I don't like this girl. And that just whole scene was so interesting to see. Usually, even if people, even if a child is born out of wedlock, most of the time, both families eventually are like, we're grateful to have this kid.
Yeah.
Even if
You're
it's
having a
difficult.
kid.
Yeah. Yeah. Difficult circumstances, maybe. But when you are so against it, that I think that shows a lack of character,
Yeah.
not in the sense of the story, but of you as a human being.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that somebody that is holier than thou, uh, is kind of very shallow,
Yeah.
at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that I also really liked Brian Tyree Henry's character, um, as the guy that just got out of prison.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I liked him, and I thought at one point going with the story and kind of reveal that maybe Fonny isn't as pure, that maybe what we're seeing is more idealized because it's from Tish's point of view, and potentially that could still be the case.
Yeah.
But just seeing Brian Tyree Henry kind of talk about prison, and that kind of change Fonny's mind a little bit, or he kind of sees the negative in life and sees how Brian Tyree Henry's talking about like how essentially he didn't do what he was accused of,
Yeah.
and kind of sees that negative twist on life, I guess.
And in a way
um
it foreshadows, Fonny's own experience,
right.
because we know at the beginning of the film that he's in jail, but a lot of this is kind of told through Tish's flashback, kind of her retelling of kind of the origins of their love story, but also how kind of it's one of those movies that kind of like starts the literary terms in media res, in the
Yep. In
moment.
the middle of things.
Yeah. And then it kind of winds things back to like, okay, here's where we are. We're starting here to get you hooked. And
Mhm.
then let's go back and figure out how we got here.
Right, which is one of my favorite storytelling
Yeah.
methods. So now we're going to move on to Rosebud and Thorn. Jake, Rosebud and Thorn, do you have some?
All right. Doing a little twist here, if you will. I have two roses. It's two things we've talked about already: the lighting and the score. When I watched this, besides the performances, those were the two things that I kept coming back to, being like, "Oh my god, this is so visually and audibly gorgeous."
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm we get off this podcast, I'm gonna go download the soundtrack on my phone, and like I just might do chores and listen to that on repeat. It is like, I love jazz. This
I
is
do too.
gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And like we talked about the lighting, but then also like all the like ulterior, not ulterior motives, but like supporting motives for why they chose that lighting scheme, and the message it helps convey, and the story it helps tell. Like it's just gorgeous. So those are my two roses. I don't have a bud, and I do have a thorn, and it's the pacing. I felt like this was a little slow of a movie, which you're gonna probably have with movies of this type. Like we said, it's an awards
Right.
film, and it's not a comedy, so there's not the timing of jokes. It's not an action movie, so there's no fight sequences. There's no there's nothing in its genre that really drives the plot forward. And so I think it really is just a story that it's like, this is what it is, take it or leave
Mm-hmm.
it. And like, I don't, I know my thorn is the pacing, because, and I did think it was slow. I would have liked to see it move a little faster, but in a way, like it's not, at the same time, I'm like, it's not a bad thing, because
Right.
I think it really draws you in, and it almost gives you that time to think at the same time. So I almost didn't
Yeah.
make this my thorn from that pure aspect, but it is a thinker, and it is something like, it's only 2 hours, but like it feels a little longer than that. So my thorn is the pacing.
No, I agree with that. I guess I'll start with my thorn. I didn't think the pacing was the problem, as much as some of for as long as the movie was, and as kind of slow burn as it was, I felt like some of the side characters didn't get their due diligence,
Mm.
especially, we talked about this earlier, like the mother character of Fawny. What was her deal? Like she
Yeah.
just like never showed up again. I
Yeah.
mean, I guess maybe the point was that she never showed up again. But then we have dedicated scenes with both of the dads. And yes, they do a little bit of payoff where they're kind of doing some side hustles to make payment work. But I felt like some of those fell through the cracks. And that's something that really bothered me.
Mm.
Um, so I would say, I can see what you're saying about the pacing. But as we talked about before, if it is more of a slow burn, maybe that is a little bit easier to swallow,
Yeah.
um, potentially. So I can see that. But for me, some of these side characters, I really wish, even though I liked the scenes they were in, I was kind of disappointed that we didn't further some of those storylines in the amount of time we had.
Yeah.
Uh, a a rose for me is the production. I think specifically the director, Barry Jenkins, and the way this movie was produced, the way it was handled. I think obviously you mentioned kind of some of the more significant uh, inspirations and the reason why they did this. But the way in which they took a story, and I know I talked about this before, but it really is my rose. The way they took the story and made it, something that everybody could it was warm. It
Mm.
was it was smooth. And that is not easy to do, especially with the kind of subject matter that we are talking about. So for them to be able to do that, I think is stellar. And that made me really appreciate this film even more, because um, they took the time to craft it right. I almost think of it there's a scene towards the end of the movie where Fonny is sculpting, and it goes around and around and around, and you've got the smoke, and the smoke kind of billows out. But I think he has his shirt off at that point, and he's chipping away. It's almost like a romanticized version of woodworking. I have a buddy that is a woodworker, and I'm pretty sure he doesn't do it like that. But shout out Drew if you're watching this.
Shirtless woodworking sounds like a lot of splinters.
Yeah,
in a lot
right.
of bad places.
Yeah, you end up looking like a porcupine.
Oh dear.
Could you imagine?
Yeah.
But that kind of, I don't know, that scene in particular, I feel like encapsulates how they crafted this movie. So that was definitely my rose. Now we come to the point in the show where we share what characters we think the other person resembles most. Jake, do you want to start off?
Sure, I'll go first. The two that kind of stuck out to me, one, Pedrocito, which is played by Diego Luna.
I just love Diego Luna because he's Cassian Andor. But
Cassian Andor. There's actually 2 Star Wars cameos in there. There's
Diego Pedro Luna Pascal's in it
too. He just walks in and sits down. I'm like, hey, it's Mando.
I was like, the casting director for all the Disney Plus shows just watched this movie and they said, yep. Yeah.
But no, Pedrocito, because I really like the scenes when they go, Fonny and Tish go and visit him, at the restaurant he works at, and he's very, he roasts Fonny a little bit, and you're always one that you try to get your roasts in.
Have to.
That came up with me, and then also the character of Daniel, Fonny's friend that just got out of jail. Purely from not because Ben has spent time in jail. Ben has no rap sheet, I promise. Unless you've hidden that from me as well.
There's no way I could.
You would not do well in jail.
No.
But I picked that purely from the fact that it reminded me a little bit of the first time we met. Or not the first time we met. The first real conversation.
True interaction.
Yeah.
I know where you're going with this, yeah.
Because, you see in the movie, kind of, Fonny's just walking down the street, and all of a sudden Daniel's there, and he's like, hey! And they meet up, blah, blah, blah. And the first really core interaction we had in my mind, you had texted in the group chat about some church thing you were inviting a bunch of guys to. The group chat for, we lived in the same hall my freshman year at Ball State. And he had texted about some church thing inviting everyone to. And I'm walking down the street in campus, reading this message on my phone. Then all of a sudden I look up and somebody is like full on like side swerving their bike to a screeching halt, cuts me off, double taps his AirPod, looks at me and says, so are you going to come? But I've not even read this full message and figured out if I'm free on whatever day this is. And sure enough, Ben Sparrow was just like, are you coming? And so that is without that interaction, we would not have this podcast.
We would not have this podcast. Yeah. So shout out to bikes, shout out to AirPods.
Yes. But it was that pure like, hey, in the middle. It's just, I don't know, for some reason, maybe it's because I was thinking about you. Because I was like, who's Ben in this? And I saw that and I'm like, I get to tell this story. I like
essentially. And I knew like the first time I met you, and I'm sure this story will come back again when we talk about characters we remind of for another movie, but we were doing a Bible study and you walked in and you had he has a bass and like a backpack for the bass as like a carrying thing, and lumbering in, and I was like, crap, he's gonna be my friend, isn't he? I literally knew
that's a negative reaction.
I literally knew. I was like, I don't know if I want him to be my friend, but I know he's going to be my friend. That's the first time. And then now here we are later.
Here we are.
I think for me, I'd have to say Tish. As somebody that is, kind, but also determined to do the right thing. I just think that really encapsulates who you are. And so I can definitely see Tish as being kind of your character. Also, maybe depending on how mad people make you, a little bit of Regina King in Puerto
I've got a
Rico.
little Biller temper in me. We Billers are known for our tempers, and I definitely have that trait at times. I try to keep it under the surface.
Yes. I think there was one time at Awaken where I think we were saying like what character people reminded me of, and then I don't know if I said this or somebody else said this, but they were like, "You're like Winnie the Pooh."
You definitely said this.
I probably did say that.
You 100% said, I just
I
think
yes,
Jake
it was
is
it
Winnie the
was me.
Pooh. And I'm just like, what are you smoking? Like, I love Winnie the Pooh, but like, do I walk around
Robin,
with like a pot of honey
honeysuckle,
saying, oh, bother?
oh bother,
My
a
tumbly is
smackable of
my
honey.
tumbly is always a grumbly. I just had
No,
lunch
I
and
I
now I
think it
want a
was that
snack.
like you're just warm and
Yeah.
friendly and kind, but Tish I think is the character that encapsulates you most. Um, Overall, this movie I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. Just sometimes with awards films, they're a slog. That's just kind of the nature of awards movies. Um, so some films that are nominated or have nominations, it's just because one performer does a really great job or something else. It's not every movie is Top Gun Maverick,
Yeah.
which is nominated for Best Picture this year. Not every movie is hardcore, just entertaining out the wazoo. But this movie, I and like I said with my Rose, I so appreciated how it was made
Yeah.
and how just smooth it was.
Yeah.
That to me just stood out among all the rest. It's an important story. I really appreciated that, but the way in which it was crafted, the care in which it was crafted, was something that I think is very fitting of the overall idea of if Beale Street could talk.
Mm.
Um, but also just shows how important this story was to Barry Jenkins.
Yeah. Beautiful film, inside and out. So if you haven't seen it, check it out.
Oh, for sure. For sure. You have any final kind of closing thoughts before we send him
I
home?
mean, really just, seconding everything you just said about, how it's so well made. The thing, the two words that come to mind when I think of this film, it's thoughtful and intentional, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which you could make the argument that every film should be thoughtful and intentional, but I think this one especially because it really it invites you to think, right? It kind of, I think maybe that's why it's a little more of a slow burn. It invites you to think. It invites you to be part of the conversation of this film, and it really just kind of presents it as this is how it is. Like, this is the movie. Take it or leave it. You know,
Yeah.
there are going to be
Yeah.
people that probably don't enjoy this film. I would challenge you to ask yourself why you don't enjoy the film, if you don't enjoy it. But it really, I think it does make you think in a lot of. It makes you think without like frustrating you in a way,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
and
And
just like
kind of,
so. Go ahead.
yeah, no, I was just going to say, and kind of going off of what you just said about, I would encourage you to watch it. And then if you don't like it, kind of think about why. One of the reasons why we do this show, do this podcast is because um, even though movies are experiential, there are, you're in a theater with a bunch of strangers and you're experiencing the exact same thing. And maybe you pull something different from it, but it's about the camaraderie in a way. That's why theater is so much fun, because you're sitting and you're watching somebody perform, but you have so many different people you don't even know, and you're all experiencing the same thing. Movies oftentimes have deeper meaning.
Mm-hmm.
They I like to say they're a lot like modern day parables. Most of them. Black Adam, maybe not, but most of the movies that I like to watch have different themes. And so what we want to encourage you guys to do, and you can leave your review for this in the comments if you liked it, if you didn't like it, maybe a couple of rosebuds and thorns, some points where you thought it was good, bad. but we want you to think,
Mhm.
because yes, movies can be popcorn, munching, you're enjoying your popcorn, you're watching this, but they can also be really thought provoking. And so we just want you to be able to experience this. And because they're thought provoking doesn't mean they're not fun. Those aren't mutually exclusive, but those aren't also interconnected. It's about analyzing in a fun way why you liked this. How can this apply to your life? Those are some of the things that Jake and I really enjoy when we watch movies, and are things that we hope to kind of pass on to you that you understand. Next week, we are watching Return to Me with David Duchovny and Minnie Driver. It's a movie that I had to watch in school and analyze as an essential rom-com. So this week is my pick, and I decided that we would do Return to Me. I'm very excited. David Duchovny, he's an actor that many people will recognize his face from, he was in the X-Files, but he really has he's a great actor, and he really has an illustrious career. And so we're really excited to discuss that with you next week. We're really glad you joined us today for our discussion on If Beale Street Could Talk. Make sure to leave a comment down below with your review. Like we said before, did you like it? Did you not? Why? And maybe some rosebuds and thorns. Throw those in there. I know not everybody's a gardener, but everybody can have a rosebud and thorn. Next week, make sure to get back here, because we are going to be talking about Return to Me. And if you liked this video, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and ring that bell to get all notifications on upcoming videos. We've got plenty of stuff down the pipeline. And yeah, this is just another episode of the Cinefile. We're so glad you joined us, and we can't wait to see you next week. For Jake Biller, I'm Ben Sparrow, and cut.